so clearly telling us the Islamic perspectives. So let's go on to the third speaker, Maurizio Ballestre from Italy.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Thank you very much. I will talk about three different issues. Is genome editing a class project? Is genome editing an enhancement rate race? And third question, is genome editing a gender project? I will quickly talk about the first two issues and then pay more attention to the last one. I know that there is a huge discussion about the moral acceptability of germline genome editing and the morality of preventing and or correcting every kind of genetic anomalies. And I know that there is a huge discussion about human enhancement, but I will assume that all of us agree that thanks to germline genome editing, the world will be a better place, above all for future generations. However, we have to consider that genetic correction and enhancement interventions could have a high or even prohibitive cost. Maybe only the best of people will be able to afford them. That is, the cost of germline intervention could be extremely high. We don't know yet how much it will cost, but today a gene therapy for a rare form of blindness costs about $850,000. Moreover, we could even imagine universal access to genome editing. The point is that the last generation could always have more advantages than the previous one, because it could have access to better and original interventions. This is an article by Robert Sparrow in which the problem issue has been discussed and analyzed. Robert Sparrow said that a rapid increase in the power of available enhancements will mean that each group of enhanced individuals will find itself in danger of being outcompeted by the next in competition for important social good. This means there could always be a gap between one generation and the next. The one coming later could always be superior. Then, and we arrive at the last issue, then we must also be aware that introducing new reproductive technologies may negatively affect our reproductive freedom. There is the risk that genome editing in the embryo becomes mandatory for people who wish to have a baby. This is the title of a novel by Ken McLeod. One of the main characters of the novel is Hope, a woman who won't take the fix, a pill that cures genetic disease and corrects all the errors in fetus's genome. She has refused once, but pressure to comply is mounting, and she won't get away with it again. She could easily claim faith group exemption, but she won't. She won't give reasons. She insists it is simply her decision. I think that this is the point. At the time of genome editing, will a woman be free to refuse a gene therapy on her embryo? In general, those who defend new technologies intervening on human genome state that the current eugenic plan is different from the past totalitarian one, and they intend to defend rather than restrain reproductive freedom. New eugenics start from the idea that parents' freedom of choice is the best antidote against the danger of coercive state policies. But if we assume that upbringing and genetic change are analogous process, why should a liberal state consider upbringing mandatory, obligatory, but leave the gene therapies or enhancement completely to their parents? Nevertheless, if germline genome editing becomes legally binding, women might be forced to reproduce with assisted reproductive technologies and take responsibility and care about genome of future generations. In fact, if the embryo were produced in vitro, diagnostic and later therapeutic intervention could be practiced at once, at the moment of conception or immediately later. But if the embryo were produced sexually, genetic editing could only be performed in an advanced phase of embryo development, because many days could go by before the pregnancy is discovered by the woman. The risk of error would then be greater, as would the probability that some cells of the embryo do not receive the desired genetic modification. I think that it is not necessary for genome editing to become legally binding. Women could be penalized and discriminated against simply on moral level. Today, women who choose to have a child are often criticized if at the moment of conception, pregnancy, or birth, they also think of their own interests. Many people expect pregnant women to undergo invasive interventions to allow the condition of their embryo's health to be monitored regularly. Further, it is often maintained that birth should always occur in hospital, and women who choose labor and birth at home or in a maternity home put their own interests before their unborn child's, so they are bad mothers. For instance, this is an article by De Crespigny and Julian Savulescu, and they argue that women who give birth at home are morally irresponsible. And then widespread vocal disapproval of public breastfeeding is well documented, but women also face pressure when they decide not to breastfeed. For many, as Fiona Walland and Lindsay Porter argue, the message they receive is clear. Mothers who do not breastfeed ought to have a darn good reason not to. Bottle feeding by choice is a failure of maternal duty. This is the article by Walland and Porter. Also, in this case, the pressure arises in part from a misconception about maternal duty. The assumption arises from the fairly uncontroversial belief that mothers have a general beneficent duty towards their offspring, and that if a given act benefits their children, they always have a duty to perform it. Why, this is the point, should we think that this attitude to women will change at the very moment when we use such technologies as germline genome editing? Mothers clearly have a general duty to benefit their offspring, but this does not imply a duty to carry out each particular beneficial act. Mothers do not have a moral duty to carry out each and every act that will benefit their baby. And I arrive to my conclusion. An assessment that does not take in consideration the interests of everyone concerned is only partial and not entirely rational. The future child's best interests are important, but the matters are just as important and worthy of attention. Reproductive risks have always been a part of women's life. Assisted reproduction would add new important risks to motherhood. But imagine that things could quickly change. Imagine that you can take a pill that cures genetic disease and corrects all the error in a fetus genome. Or imagine that you can have artificial in vitro gametes from your somatic cells and use an artificial womb. I think that in this case, the moral responsibility of women could change. In this case, what are the woman's moral responsibilities? The conclusion is that we must think about the responsibility that we have towards future generations and how fair is to balance their interests with our own, demanding that once pregnancy has been chosen, the woman sacrifices all her interests and well-being for the unborn child's well-being is unfair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a very stimulating talk from a different angle from other ordinary talks. We put this talk in the middle so that we can enjoy the stimulation. And thank you also for keeping the time. Yeah, so let's go on to the fourth speaker, Satoshi Kodama from Kyoto University, my fellow Japanese. Please.
Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm very honored and also very excited to be a part of this historic summit held in the University of Hong Kong. My name is Satoshi Kodama, and I teach moral philosophy at Kyoto University, Japan. Today, I would like to briefly explain Japan's regulatory framework concerning genome editing in human embryos and discuss what I take to be the important considerations for future discussions in Japan and beyond. So in the first and second part, I will briefly talk about Japan's draft guidelines on research involving the use of gene editing tools in human embryos and how it fits into the general framework given by the expert panel on bioethics. In the third part, I would like to evaluate the Japanese discussion so far. Word of caution, I'm not representing Japan's government. I wish I was, but no any organization whatsoever. So what I talk today is solely my personal opinion and nothing else. So first, draft guidelines. So the last month, there was a news article in Nature. Its headline was, Japan set to allow gene editing in human embryos. These guidelines are yet to be finalized, but they will allow basic research involving genome editing tools using spare embryos for improvement of assisted reproductive technology. Such research, for example, will look into the generation and development of human embryos and how better to preserve them for reproduction. On the other hand, the guidelines do not allow basic research for the treatment of genetic diseases or other diseases like cancer, nor do they allow clinical application, that is, putting the gene-edited human embryos into the uterus. And the expert panel on bioethics and research using human embryos. So the above guidelines are product of ongoing discussion by the expert panel on bioethics down there with the red circle, which is a subcommittee of the Council for Science, Technology, and Innovation up there. Within the Cabinet Office of Government, that is within the Cabinet Office of Government of Japan. Here I summarize the discussion of the expert panel in 3 steps. So first, the expert panel established the basic or fundamental principles concerning the handling of human embryos back in 2004, when they had a heated debate on the acceptability of creation of embryonic stem cells that would involve the destruction of embryos. The main message of the basic principles was handle human embryos with great care. That is, although they are strictly speaking just sprouts of human life, and do not possess human dignity themselves, nevertheless, the human embryos need to be protected to maintain our fundamental societal value of human dignity. That said, the basic principles did admit the exceptional use of human embryos for research purposes on 3 conditions. One is such research must be scientifically justifiable. 2, safety issues need to be addressed if such research involves human participants. And 3, the expected benefit of such research needs to be socially appropriate. The justification of such exception was that such research might contribute to individuals' pursuit of happiness, including health and welfare. Second, it was in light of these basic principles that the expert panel issued an interim report in April 2016, 2 years ago, on the permissibility or impermissibility of research using the genome editing tools in human embryos. In the report, the panel followed the reasoning of the basic principles and endorsed research using the genome editing tools to look into the functions of genes in the early development and differentiation of human embryos. However, it did not allow the use of human embryos in research for developing new treatment of genetic diseases or other diseases like cancer, because there may be alternative ways to do such basic research which do not involve the use and destruction of human embryos. Nor did the panel see any scientifically valid reasons for the creation of human embryos for research purposes. And third, the task force within or under the expert panel on bioethics issued the first report in December 2017. Although the primary objective of the task force was to review and possibly revise the basic principles in light of the recent development of genome editing technology, so far it has not proposed any changes in the principles. Instead, it has followed again the reasoning of the basic principles and issued a recommendation that the relevant ministries should establish the guidelines on research involving the use of gene editing in human embryos. So that brings us back to the draft guidelines I mentioned at the beginning of my talk and discussion. So that was a summary of Japan's regulations regarding genome editing in human embryos. I would like to quickly point out 3 general considerations. First, my evaluation of the basic principles approach. Japan has chosen to use the basic principles to evaluate the permissibility or impermissibility of particular types of research using genome editing in human embryos. The expert panel has already approved one type of such research, as I explained above. And it is, as I understand, it is now considering whether basic research into genetic diseases and other diseases like cancer are permissible in light of the basic principles. I approve of this kind of piecemeal approach, since as long as the basic principles and its application to the particular types of research are sound and thoughtful, it would work well and would produce consistent policies. On the other hand, there are several limitations to this basic principles approach, owing much to the fact that the basic principles is a sort of legacy principles that was made to protect human embryos from careless handling and destruction in research involving embryonic stem cells. Thus, the scope of the basic principles is limited. It stipulated 3 conditions for the exceptional use of human embryos in research which would destroy embryos. However, because the basic principles focused on the handling of human embryos, it is silent on the use of other kinds of germline cells like sperm and unfertilized eggs. In other words, it does not say whether such research would undermine our societal value of human dignity or not. It is also silent on the clinical application of genome editing tools, which would result in possible birth of genetically modified children. The interim report of 2016 gave several reasons against the clinical application and concluded that it was not permissible at the moment. But the reasons it gave were not related to the idea of human dignity. So while I think the approach or methodology itself is correct, the basic principle approach needs a major revamp to overcome these limitations. Second, I believe that there needs to be more democratic elements in policymaking. The expert panel on bioethics does recognize the need for more public discussion, but does not seem to be very enthusiastic about suggesting legislation on research using human embryos. I noticed that some bioethics scholars in Japan, including legal scholars, are reluctant to recommend legislation because it takes a long time to make a law, and the law is inflexible once it's made. That's all true, but I think legislation has the virtue of being more democratic than the discussion by the panel of experts. Discussing bioethics at the level of an expert panel is like doing bioethics incognito. If we want to have a public discussion on bioethical issues, legislation will lead to more discussion. Perhaps the topics like genome editing are somewhat difficult to general public, but there will be more efforts to make the topic understandable if legislation is to take place. Third and the last, notice that how secular the discussion in Japan is. There's no talk on Buddhism or Confucianism in the basic principles or reports made by the expert panel. The idea of human dignity is not associated with Christianity or any other religion, but posited merely as one of the fundamental values of Japanese society. This apparent absence of religion needs careful examination, but one reason may be doing bioethics incognito. If legislative efforts are made, diverse perspectives, including those of religion, will be expressed and examined in the process. Hopefully, this will enrich the discussion in formulating the fundamental values of the Japanese society and beyond. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Satoshi. You highlighted the issues we, or at least many of the countries, share by showing Japanese situation. Okay, so please keep the questions and the comments for the general discussion later on. So we now go to the last speaker, Margaret Seaborn Faulkner from United Kingdom. Margaret, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My talk will be on the way of the human genome, and you might understand this title if you know that my background is anthropology and East Asia studies. Well, bioethical orientations to genome editing are too narrow. The regulation of safety and efficacy of new applications enables clinical research, but the ability to define research ethics and good science, as we have seen in the field of regenerative medicine, has become a matter of power and competition. Regulation is brokered by governments that announce life science advancement as a way to increase their national GDPs. Surely this focus on a high advancement as a way to increase the national, as a solution to genetic diseases is laudable. After all, an embryo edited for disease and disability prevents suffering, enhances human capacity, and saves social and economic resources. But here I suggest we need to reflect about the foundation of human health issues. What values do we use to define disease, disability, and enhancement? And what means do we use to attend to human suffering and identity? Although I was invited to this panel to reflect on Asian traditions of thought in this context, I will focus on shared elements from both Asia and Western traditions. But I will start by citing some issues in human genome editing and germline intervention. Apart from issues around genome pollution, germline intervention is worrying as it promises to affect traditional notions of the family, reproduction, human being, and relations between generations. According to stem cell scientist Paul Knupfler, research will use large numbers of embryos and gametes, and its experimental nature will seriously complicate pregnancy and reproductive decision-making. Further, prospective parents will be forced to reflect on what are healthy or better babies or people, which will affect social values fundamentally. Social pressure exerted through education, state resources, the media, and public opinion can lead to the devaluation of certain kinds of people, such as with the steep decline in the birth of people with Down syndrome after NIPT. Rather than viewing newborns as a gift, a wish come true, or an accident, we will have to think of children as products. As a result, the relation between parents and child will resemble that of a designer and a designed, entailing new responsibilities, liabilities, and ambitions. So, how can germline intervention be proposed without dealing with such predictable issues first? We need to understand how nature, including human nature, has become an object of scientific research and as a resource to be exploited. Many traditions share notions of knowledge as embodied in skill, emphasizing the natural integrity of humans with their direct environment. Such skills are not based on preconceived models, but molded in the process of their application and use. A distinction is made between skills we learn gradually through tradition and practice and problem solving. For instance, we learn to ride a bicycle through bodily practice, yielding embodied skills. But we also admire quick fix solutions, for instance, magic spells, pills, and why not, the crossbreeding of cattle. In our search for medical blockbusters, we are in a similar hurry. Here, genome editing is pulled by its promise to solve a large range of problems and our dreams about the practical good. But there is also a societal push. We like to be first to acquire patents, receive honors, set the standards and define the rules of the field, to dominate it, to be at the forefront of international competition, have a comparative advantage, and help our countries get out of their economic slumps. Psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, in his study of the two hemispheres of the brain, showed the way in which modern Western cultures attend to things is utility-oriented, associated with the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere operates at the expense of the more relational mode of attention of the right hemisphere. McGilchrist shows how the left hemisphere is more oriented on the conceptual and the visual, while the right hemisphere prioritizes the embodied and appreciates the unique and implicit. He traces this back in evolutionary terms to the needs of, for instance, birds to keep their right eye on picking seeds to feed themselves and the left eye to keep on the lookout for predators. They use different modes of attending, whereby the left hemisphere pays close attention to how it can utilize or grasp things, and the right hemisphere looks at the context and connection. Thus, the left hemisphere is better attuned to tools and to whatever is inanimate, machine-like, and made by itself. The right hemisphere is adapted to dealing with living things other than itself, things flexible, organic, constantly changing. Only the right hemisphere has a whole body image. The left hemisphere regards the body as an assemblage of parts. For the right hemisphere, we live the body. For the left hemisphere, we live in it, rather as we drive a car. It is suggested that through rationalization and individualization, Western societies have started to privilege the left hemisphere. This creates a split between mind and body, forcing a distance between our thinking tools and our environment. It enables us to gather vast disembodied information to experiment with, to trade with, and to police populations. We now face experimental human germline intervention dependent on industry and a market that risks changing humanity as we know it. The potential magic of germline intervention affects so many aspects of life that the societal implications are too complex to define, let alone address. This problem has arisen partly because modern science has separated itself from the environment of its objects of interest. First, in genome editing, pre-existing general genome maps guide genome editing in embryos with their own unique but unsequenced genetic codes, making intervention experimental. As a consequence, it alters the reproductive environment of future human offspring. Second, science defines differences in health and ability in terms of genetic endowment at the point of embryonic conception, separate from the potential individual and their life worlds. Third, gene editing skills themselves are developed as a part of societal environments. In modernity, especially since the introduction of the Bayh-Dole Act, scientific skills develop hand in hand with industrial expansion, scientific policy making, global competition, regulatory strategy, and state interests. They are no longer kept in check by traditions, only by thin models of bioethics and rather limited public consultations organized by scientific elites. Notions of nature and traditional beliefs have moral implications for genome editing. Although nature has been misused to discriminate other abled people, many traditions of thought use it to appreciate humans as they are. Close relations are observed between nature and morality in Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, Sufi, and Christian forms of Western mysticism, and in more recent green spiritualist movements ranging from adherents of Gaia theory, Wicca, to deep green religions and political movements such as Green parties and Greenpeace. What they share is a desire for harmonious living with others, nature and their environment, a view of life as gift, destiny or path, encouraging contentment with one's lot, warning against the overestimation or over-theorization of disembodied knowledge at the cost of irreversible damage to the environment or ourselves, the cultivation of intuitive and spiritual faculties, views of nature as imbued with vitality, mystery, Tao. Taoism, for instance, tries to move away from views of nature as lacking its own integrity, away from a notion of creatures experienced and valued only as objects, away from a zeal for intrusively transforming places and creatures according to their yield or their convenience to human beings, and away from a hubristic confidence in the capacity of human beings to manage and order the natural world. Philosophers from cultures with prevailing secularism and scientism may object. But these views of nature play a role in many everyday life cosmologies and practices. At least some of these notions are shared by most of us. The need to be in harmony with the environment, back to nature, spiritual wellness and moderation, and natural foods. Despite cruel death and disease, many of us feel at home in nature and it's good. Many of us know that human diversity is important and that we are interdependent. Although many people appreciate new medical technologies, most do not trust humanity with the technological powers it has acquired, and fear of the iatrogenic consequences set off by pharmaceutical drugs, regenerative medicine, and gene therapy is widespread. It is, of course, not my intention to oppose science. We need it. Only the narrow material interests that skew its work and the way applications are being marketized. The current world puts a technological fix before human care. Many centuries ago, Taoism tried to escape attitudes of grasping things by immersing with the environment. McGilchrist's work evidences the current preoccupation with reductive machine metaphors. It is only by sidelining the right hemisphere that the left hemisphere can insist on the merits of germline intervention to humanity in the current environment. The regulatory facilitation of germline intervention, even or probably especially if conditional, will be used to justify the wholesale exploitation of this field. After all, it promises possible wealth to anyone who wishes to enter global competition by any means, and with consequences we have no way of knowing, let alone control. Thank you for listening.